We're gonna go over if you are genetically capable of being strong, and we're gonna start right now. All right, so we're gonna start off right off the bat with a really cool freaking study on fiber typing of a world champion shot putter. Now, this is gonna be a long one, so we gotta bear with me here. We're gonna cover some of the key factors around what this looks like. And the reason why I immediately wanna look at genetics from an actual world champion shot putter is because they compared fiber typing through muscle biopsies to this individual's brother. Okay, and so some of the really cool stuff here is that when they were looking at this athlete, Werner Gunther, who we've actually done a video on, he was an absolute dog, total savage. They took vastus lateralis out of his body. And I always think about lateralis from Tool, but anyway, let's get back to this. And they're looking at his untrained brother. They were analyzed for fiber type distribution. We're gonna get into the genetic component here. Okay, so they're looking at using staining methods, and then they're looking through and they're saying, okay, in shot putter 1, type 2 fibers amounted to only 40%. Type 2, fast twitch, only 40%. Due to their selective hypertrophy, however, type 2 fibers accounted for 67.2% of the total cross-sectional area. The type 1 fibers in shot putter 1 were similar in size to his untrained brother. So after 3 years of active D training, type 2 fibers of shot putter 1 had reduced in size. Okay, so they got smaller to values closer to those of his brother. So they became more sort of like genetically familiar to the same size as his brother, who was untrained. A large difference between type 1 and type 2 fiber size, even in the untrained state and in both his shot putter 1 and his brother, is not usually seen in humans and may be a genetic characteristic. Okay, so right here we're looking at this genetic or this fiber type may have been a genetic characteristic. However, we just got to remember that's just 2 individuals, right? So when we're thinking about this, and this is what they end up saying, is that we suggest that the ability to selectively increase the relative area of his type 2 fibers in the 15 years of strength training was a key element to his success as a shot putter. So this immediately is sort of this light bulb of like, okay, well, genetically, he's pretty slow twitch, but he's a shot putter, which is one of the most explosive athletes on the planet outside like gymnasts, weightlifters, jumpers. There's not many athletes as explosive as shot putters. So genetically, you would look at that and say, well, he's not going to be capable of being that explosive, especially related, when they look at his brother. But his training for 15 plus years led to this hypertrophy of those type 2 fibers. And so it's a really, really interesting aspect that we have to look at and think through. And then I believe we should be comparing this to this study, okay, which brings up long-term resistance-trained human muscles have more fibers and more myofibrils and tighter myofilament packing than untrained. Meaning, in this specific paper here, if you train for 15 plus years, okay, so they go through this and they say increases in skeletal muscle size occur in response to prolonged exposure to resistance training that is typically ascribed to increased muscle fiber size. Increase in skeletal muscle happens if you lift for a long period of time. Now, the cross-sectional study compared muscle fiber and myofibril characteristics in long-term resistance-trained individuals versus untrained. So they went and they looked through this, and the interesting component here is that they essentially look at this and they're like the larger muscles of the long-term resistance-trained individuals exhibited more fibers. They had more fibers. Okay, so they're thinking there might be some hyperplasia occurring here, and very likely that's occurring. Is that people who lift for long periods of time have this occasion to achieve hyperplasia, which means they have more fibers, so a fiber will split into another fiber. And looking at that previous paper, we can think through and say, okay, well then, genetically this individual was predetermined essentially from genetics to be slower twitch, but they ended up being a really explosive shot putter that ended up winning world titles, 3 of them. Now, and he got 4th at the Olympics in '92. I want to take this, okay, and we're looking at those first 2 papers and now start to jump into some really, really interesting research on twins. Before we get into the next research paper, if you guys are looking for a training resource, you want a training program that's designed by us, based off of science, based off of our own success here at Garage Strength, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. You can download Peak Strength. You can get into Peak Strength, select a specific sport that you want to train for. You can draw out when you want to hit a big time peak, and it's going to build a program specific to your needs. Now, let's get back to those research papers. So we're gonna look at 3 papers now to try and determine, is genetics a huge factor? And if it is, what can we do? And if it isn't, what can we do? And in this first paper, okay, we're gonna be looking at twins and their genetic influences on muscle strength, lean body mass, and bone mineral density. And the big factor here is that I wanted to point out is that they're looking at older twins. Okay, so they're looking at 706 postmenopausal women, 227 pairs of monozygous, so identical twins, 126 pairs of fraternal twins. They're measuring grip strength, which is a really, really accurate determination as far as overarching body health and overarching strength of the entire body. Bone mineral density is another thing that sort of is a very key. If you're very bone minerally dense, you likely have been resistance-based training, and then on top of that, lean body mass. And so the interesting factor around this paper is that when they were looking at things like the leg extensor test and they're seeing how explosive they are, all 3 muscle variables have a moderate genetic component with heritability, meaning as far as everything's concerned, when they're looking at the leg extensor test, bone mineral density, grip strength, it's very moderate. The genetic component is very moderate. So they're saying right here, all 3 muscle variables have a moderate genetic component with heritability. Estimates of 0.52 for lean body mass, 0.46 for leg extensor strength, and only 0.3 for overarching grip strength. The genetic component of bone mineral density was not significantly reduced after adjusting for lean mass and muscle strength. Okay, so in conclusion, this data suggests that the 3 variables have a modest genetic component, basically suggesting the potential for clinical intervention and lifestyle modifications. There's a moderate genetic component behind this paper, but we've got to recognize that when there's moderate components, we can have some type of lifestyle impact. And I want you to think back to the first study we talked about. Okay, so the first study was the world champion shot putter and what his genetic predisposition was and what ends up occurring. Okay, so now let's get into another really interesting one. Okay, this is in 1996, inheritance of physical fitness in 10-year-old twins and their parents. Now what's ironic here, this is from 96, so this study was probably done in 93, 94 of 10-year-old twins. These people are probably exactly my age. I was born in 84. So they're looking at 105 10-year-old twins, okay, and their parents, okay? So they took them through 9 motor tests and 6 skin fold measures were administered. Okay, 6 is pretty good for body fat counts. They're looking at motor tests, a whole bunch of different stuff like running speed, speed of limb movement, balance, static strength, explosive strength, trunk strength, functional strength, and then even VO2 max and flexibility. And so the significance and contribution of genetic and environmental factors to variation in physical fitness were tested with model fitting. They're looking at performance-related fitness characteristics. They're moderate to highly heritable, which in my interpretation is this is showing that there is a fairly substantial inheritable, you're inheriting something from your parents. It's very, very genetic. And what I wanted to do here was to look at this test on 10-year-olds. Okay, so they're looking at twins that are 10 years old and they're seeing that genetic component is pretty dang high. And if we compare that to the postmenopausal twins, okay, where we had, 700 plus women, we're looking at the genetic components seem to be a little bit lower. Okay, so it's interesting, and I think that's just something that we've got to keep in mind. So performance-related fitness characteristics, again, right here, this line, pretty, in my mind, they're inherited based off of what this study is saying. Now, assortative mating was significant and positive for speed components, balance, trunk strength, cardiorespiratory fitness. Again, that's going to be looking at things like the VO2 max test. And then static strength, explosive strength, functional strength. I would like to know how they're determining functional strength versus explosive strength, and a difference here between cardiorespiratory fitness in that point and cardiorespiratory fitness in the other one. The hypothesis here is that performance-related fitness characteristics are more, so right here, performance-related fitness characteristics are more determined by genetic factors than health-related fitness was not supported. So genetic factors have a predominant effect on fitness at the prepubertal age. One thing that I'm going to take out of this immediately is that the genetic component, let's say that your children are playing youth soccer and we're all standing, or better yet, in the United States, they're playing youth baseball, youth football, and your son or daughter has not hit puberty. Essentially, the success of your children is going to be highly correlated to what your genetic makeup is physiologically, okay, at that young age. Now, if your child is very successful at an early age, there needs to be, based off of the other studies, and we're gonna get into one more, there needs to be some type of protocol or thought process to try and maintain and increase the genetic component, because it seems that the genetic component can be overwritten based off of some of this other research, okay? So then I wanna get into one more paper here, and I wanna just go over this again. Prepubertal age, genetic factors have the predominant effect on fitness. So I can blame my parents for being a fat kid when I was younger. Okay, so now we're gonna get into this last paper here. Fitness and strength responses to distinct exercise modes in twins. Okay, and essentially this is just gonna be, how do twins respond to different types of exercise, and then their response, is it genetic, is it environmental? And they even cover in this paper, it's pretty interesting because they go into, even to the point of like neighborhood activity actually has a really large impact on how individuals develop over a long period of time. If somebody grows up in a very young neighborhood that is surrounded by a lot of younger kids, they tend to be much more active than those that don't. And that does make sense from an environmental perspective. Okay, so when we're looking at this paper, in this novel, this is cool. In this novel, randomized crossover design study, monozygotic and dizygotic twins. Monozygotic, identical. Dizygotic, fraternal. They took these twins, they underwent 3 months of resistance and endurance training, separated by a 3-month washout period. And they were aiming to assess training responses and strength and fitness outcomes to dichotomous training modalities, as well as the genetic and environmental contributions to exercise response. Okay, so they're trying to figure out how are they gonna respond, and is it genetic, is it environmental, right? And their findings indicate that individual responsiveness differs between exercise modalities. So seems that some people might respond really well to cardiovascular training, some people might respond well to, some younger kids might respond well to resistance-based training, and so forth. So think about it along those lines. And then the present study has implications for those charged with optimizing the benefits of exercise by means of individualizing the exercise prescription. And I think that's an important thing to really think about with younger kids, is that when you're seeing a younger kid coming up, they might be more genetically prone to being successful in one type of sport. And if as coaches or as parents, we don't necessarily see them in that sport, let's say that they're supposed to be a shot putter and they're swimming, it does, and a long distance swimmer for that matter, it would be better for them to get into swimming. But at the same time, based off of the very first paper with the world champion shot putter, it's likely also something that can be overwritten within a year or so. It can be overwritten, and that individual can become successful in that specific area eventually, based off their training and their body's ability to adapt. And so some of this stuff is interesting. I just wanted to highlight here is that additionally, genes may not play as large of a role. And if we look here at their abstract, you can see here, our findings indicate that individual responsiveness differs between modalities, and low responders to one mode may be rescued by switching to an alternate mode. Okay, so additionally, genes may not play as large of a role. Okay, so let's look at this again. Additionally, genes may not play as large of a role as previously estimated from cross-sectional data or training adaptation. Cross-sectional data did not reflect longitudinal training effects. That's a big factor here, is that from this specific study, they basically are looking at this and they're saying, yes, there will be a genetic disposition to specific areas, but you can be rescued by an alternate switch, but you probably will be better off in the first one, but your body's capable of switching potentially as well. And some of the information out there, or some of the genetic thoughts prior, is that there wasn't any sort of long-term analysis of training effect, and they're looking at this like 3 months. It's longer term. Okay, it's not great, but it is longer, so 12 weeks. This can also help us individualize the actual training for specific athletes if we can do an assessment and find out what type of athlete they are. So what do I think about all this stuff? I think, one, we've got to look at the younger an athlete is, the more we are seeing what their genetic makeup is when they're doing a specific task that is physically based. The older the individual is, the more they're going to be based around environmental factors. Okay, so that's how we've got to think through the lens. The other big factor here is that they're seeing that within 3 months, somebody can sort of alter and they can work into their specific area if they like that. Basically, I know I'm jumping a little bit to conclusions, but within 3 months, that's a longer time frame of training to override potential genetic factors. I think it's important to jump back to the first study on Gunther and think through, he was training for 15 plus years and was able to achieve some type of fiber change or fiber hypertrophy to the sport that would make him more explosive or make him override his own genetic capabilities. So we were able to see from Gunther that he was able to do that in training. And then the second study, we were seeing in the second study on hyperplasia that athletes or individuals that were resistance training for 15 plus years were achieving, they have more myofibers and myofibrils. That's another big component, is that if we are thinking about long-term success as coaches, and if we're thinking about long-term success as athletes, we've got to buy into achieving the reps, getting the reps done, doing the work consistently for long periods of time. And this paper is saying 3 months. I'm saying if you're in middle school, start training right now. If you're in 6th grade, start training 3 to 4 days a week and start working towards those goals. Identify what your purpose is. Identify what's going to make you happy. What's going to motivate you. What do you want to do in athletics, and start getting that work done. Because if you're sitting there, you're 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, and you start training for 15 years, that puts you at the age of 30, and you can really, really do a good job of impacting your overall own path in your own journey. You are not limited entirely by your genetics. You can take those genetics and you can change them, and you can improve to a point, in the sense that the work that you're doing, the environmental impact that you're putting on your genetics, the lifts, getting under the bar, doing plyometrics, doing sprints, those things can have a positive impact and help you get to that next level. And again, if you need help with your programming, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store, or the Apple iOS Store. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.